Sorry about this. Okay, so there must be something, right, that takes as input some sort of syntactic structure and then is returning as output something like an interpretation, okay? And even the most anti-grammatical guy must admit that we have a way to combine phrases into different ways to account for syntactic ambiguity, for the fact that the same sentence can be assigned to completely different interpretations that are depending on the order in which the constituents are interpreted, okay? So there is something, and that could be thought of as compositional semantics, that interprets the constituents according to the order they appear in the sentence, or to the order that the structure of the sentence is built, and this interpretation is recursive. And it is indicated by syntax, okay? So some people say that there is a very, very nice correspondence to some syntactic operation like merge and semantic operation called, for instance, functional application or predicate modification, all stuff that you might do in your intro to semantics class, okay? That when you combine a determiner with a noun together, when you have the owl, okay, you create a syntactic object, which is a DP, but you also combine the meaning of the and the meaning of owl. So you have a very, very tight correspondence between your semantics and your syntax. And we, as a speaker of language, must possess a semantic competence which determines the semantic judgment we are able to give with respect to two or more sentences, okay? And we have seen that we agreed a lot, for instance, on certain relations like contradictions, synonymy, presuppositions, and we agreed a little bit less when it came to implicatures and also to logical entailment, okay? With logical entailment, we agreed a lot, but only if we made sure that we would interpret logical operators in the same way. And we have seen that this is a little bit problematic, okay? With contradiction and synonymy and presupposition, we agreed completely, 100%, okay? You actually agreed on also a certain interpretation of numbers. Right, so different factors, operators like and, or, the, or it was, give rise to different semantic relations. However, presupposition and implicatures bear a tight relationship with the utterance context, right? With the fact of whether there is a unique owl or there are two of them. So at some way, our conception, our conceiving on the utterance context must be, in a way translated into a format that can be put in relation with the meaning of your sentence, with the interpretation of the words that you're using in the sentence, okay? This is pragmatics. This is one of the main jobs of pragmatics, to determine and to explain how our knowledge about the context, our external linguistic knowledge, okay, about how the things that I'm seeing right now in front of me are unfolding in front of me, how that things comes into interaction with the lexical meaning of words and with the meaning of connectives and with the meaning of the sentence, okay? So yes, the question two, do we have a semantic competence? We must have a semantic competence that accounts for the fact that we all interpret certain things in the same way, and we all agree to certain meaning relations. Right, so as there is a correspondence between semantics and syntax, there is also tight correspondence between semantics and pragmatics, okay? And this was the introduction of these important issues that are going to recur in our course over and over and over, okay? So do you have any question now, or we can let Mike tell us a little bit more about QR and other fancy syntactic operations? Okay, I guess, Mike, you can take the mic.
Okay.
Can you stop sharing? All right.
Okay. Give me a second. Okay, can you guys all see my screen?
Yes.
Beautiful. Can you also see my cursor moving?
Yes.
Beautiful. Okay, and okay, beautiful. Okay, so before we start, if you have any questions or anything, like, please interrupt me, either talk or send something in the chat, because I don't think I can see your reactions because I don't have all the portraits in front of me, but I should be able to see the chat.
I will shout.
Okay, that's also fine.
Can I
Please,
smoke a cigarette?
Sure.
Thanks.
So, and please don't wait. Like, if anything is unclear, just make yourself known and I'll do my best to address these questions. Okay, so I don't think we need to wait for Danny.
No, I'm here. Go on.
Ah, he's there. Okay, right. Okay, so I'll be talking today about quantifier raising and reconstruction. And if neither of these two things mean anything to you, that's fine. I'll introduce them very slowly. So, but before we do that, let's talk about the two types of merge that we all know, right? We all talked about merge or some variation of merge in our intro to syntax classes, right? And the first type of merge is base generation, right? So that is called external merge in minimalism, right? And here you see 3, maybe 4 kinds of base generation. So first we have Peter here being base generated in the complement position of the word, right? It's externally merged from the lexicon to the syntactic derivation. And the same happens with Mary here in 2, and with the modal must in the head of T. Yeah, so this is the most basic form of merge. But there's also
Mike, sorry, I already have a question.
What
does it mean externally merged?
So in minimalism, there are 2 kinds of basically introducing elements into the structure, right? Into the trees as you see them here. One is you take them from externally to syntax. So you go to the lexicon, pick Peter because you want to talk about Peter, and then you put that lexical element and some more structure into the tree, right? So you end up with Peter, and Peter also projects the DP. And that's external merge and base generation. And these 2 terms are equivalent.
Aha, wow. It's the first time that I understand it.
Right. And so, but in addition to this...
I have a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
What's the equivalent in X-bar theory?
So in X-bar theory, you would just say base generation.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's
okay,
just like putting a word into the structure.
Uh-huh. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Right, but we know that this is not everything, right? There has to be more to syntax because we know that stuff moves, right? Like constituents don't stay in the same position throughout the entire derivation. Oh, and that we see here, right? So we know that in English, in order to make a declarative sentence, we need to move, because of the EPP, we need to move the subject from the specifier of VP or little VP, whatever, it doesn't matter here. We need to move that constituent to the specifier of TP, right? So and you see that here. So the DP Mary gets moved from the specifier of VP to the specifier of TP, right? And we can talk all day about why that needs to happen, but we're not really interested in that, right? Maybe it's agreement, something else, doesn't matter. And this is called, in minimalism, this is called internal merge, right? Because we have a constituent that is already in the structure, and then we just move it somewhere else. We put it somewhere else. That's why it's internal. We don't go to the lexicon or everything. We can just stay in the structure that we have and modify it in some way. And actually, there are 2 theories of movement that we know, or that are popular, I guess. One is the copy theory, and that's the one I've indicated here. right? So Mary is actually, the DP Mary is actually in two places at once. The first one is the base position in the specifier of VP, and the second one is the derived position, right? The new position, and that's the specifier of TP. But the other theory, which is more popular in older frameworks, is actually the trace theory of movement. And in those theories, you would have, instead of the copy here in the lower position, you would just have a T and co-index that T with the higher element, right? It doesn't really matter for us. Whichever way you feel more comfortable with is totally fine. I just chose this one because it shows, I think, more clearly that Mary is actually in two places at once. So, and then, right, we can move all day long. So something that I do here is I want to go to an interrogative sentence, right? So who does Mary like? And I'll show you the first few steps here. So what we have again is that Mary moves to the specifier of TP, but instead of earlier where we had the modal in T, we now have does, right? And in interrogative sentences, this would move to C, right? It's again internal merge. It's the same thing. I've annotated here the difference between phrasal movement and head movement, but it doesn't matter. Like, you don't have to care about this. But
how can I raise my hand?
Okay. You can just talk. It's fine.
As if I raise my hand. So I have a question. So you are saying that Mary is moving from the VP internal position to a higher position, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when I speak, I say, does Mary like? Who does Mary like?
No, so, we're not done. We're not done. Okay. I actually want to go to this sentence. Okay. So it's who does Mary like?
Right. Sorry. Who does Mary like? But like my question is very basic. So why do you say that Mary moves up? If I say Mary first while I speak, so
right. So that is sort of the difference between, right? So you're more comfortable with parsing, right? But that is sort of the way a hearer would deal with language, right? They would hear the top left most element first and then build sort of to the bottom right. But what we conceptualize of syntax is usually what the speaker does, right? So we start at the bottom left. So the core of every utterance usually is the verb, and then we build the entire syntax around it, right? So we start with like, and then we need an object to satisfy some feature, then we need a subject to satisfy some feature, and then we build up further.
Okay, so you are sort of assuming that when I speak, right, mm-hmm. I have my logical form in my mind, I have my meaning, I have my semantic interpretation, and then I have somehow encoded into a syntactic structures that then I can utter in order for you to understand what I'm saying, right?
Well, yes. I mean that is all very contentious, right? Like, so as a person who follows generative grammar, yes, I would say you start with syntax and you build it up, and then you have spell out, right, which enables you to talk, right? You utter it or you sign it if you're a sign language person. But yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Now it's clear.
Are there any, I can't see the chat, can I? Okay, so you just have to talk or otherwise like make yourself known, because I don't think I can see the chat.
Okay, don't worry.
Okay, so are there any more questions about this? I know, let's go to the other one first, right? And then the last step to have the final question, who does Mary like, is to move the direct object, right? Like the who in the complement position of V, all the way up to spec CP, right? And that's the clause initial element. So in the simplified syntax, right, like this would not be okay in a syntax class, but for us it's fine. This is how we conceive of movement. But actually, there is more to this. So what we've seen now is overt movement, right? We can see that something moved, right? At the end, something ends up at the clause initial position, and we know for reasons that it was further down at some point. So speakers of German know this if they've ever taken a class in syntax, right? Because our subordinate clauses have the verbs in the final position, and in main clauses, we can see it moves up to the second position, right? So we have a very clear indication that something moved because we can hear it and see it. But there's another type, and that's the one we'll be dealing with today, that is, and this is a movement type that is covert, so we can't see it, right? The effects are there somehow, but we can't see it in the linear order. And you might now be thinking, why would we move if we can't see it, right? That is like it's a strong claim because, first of all, it's very difficult for children to learn something that doesn't have a direct evidence, right? So for language acquisition, it's a very tall order to assume covert movement. But sometimes we just don't have a choice. And there are different reasons as to why we might not have a choice. And the most important one is compositionality or composability considerations. Sometimes we need to move something in order for the sentence to be interpretable at all and for the derivation not to crash. And sometimes, and that's more trivial, I don't think it's trivial, but it's easier, and that's the one we'll be dealing with today, is interpretability, right? We need to account for some readings in a sentence, and the only way for us to do so sometimes is covert movement. So, and I'm not sure how far along you guys are, but can anybody think of examples for covert movement? I mean, I've named 2 of them, but do you have examples? Like if you don't, that's completely fine. I wasn't actually expecting for you guys to know any. I'll introduce them slowly, don't worry. So the one, before we go on, there's a little disclaimer. So I will be simplifying a lot of this. So there's actually more to this, but I have an appendix. So, and I think Danny will upload the slides. So you can have a look at the appendix, and there it's a bit more in depth and a bit more correct. But for expository reasons, I'll be very brief and simplify quite a bit. Okay, so the first type of movement is quantifier raising, and that's arguably the most important and the most famous type of covert movement. So now let's introduce why we need covert movement, namely quantifier raising. So we have the German sentence here. The English sentence is equivalent, I think, but my intuitions are just stronger in German, so I'll have German sentences here. Alle Kinder guckten einen Film. All children watched a movie. I think for speakers of Austrian German, schauten might probably be more adequate, but you get what I mean. So all children watched a movie. And just for reference, so alle here is the universal quantifier, and this upside down A is the symbol we typically use for that. And einen is the existential quantifier, and that's the inverted E, right? And the typical example for the existential quantifier, so the E, is some in English. So what does this sentence mean? Does anybody have a guess? So like you've seen Danny use like this quasi-formal language, right? There's an individual X, blah, blah, blah. Can anybody try or like somehow explain what the sentence might mean?
So we can say there are children, and yeah, we can. So wait, I had it in my mind, but now I can't really.
Yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah. So okay, so there are children in the world, and for all of them, it is true that they watch a movie.
Right.
And there are films in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and for one film, it is true that all children watched it.
perfect, right? That is definitely one interpretation that we have. So for all children X, it holds that X watched a movie, and that is the same movie, right? So I don't know which movie all children might have watched, but you get the idea, right? But there's also another interpretation here. So the one that we heard just now is the one in 9b. So for one specific movie, it is the case that every kid watched it, right? And this is the interpretation where we interpret the existential before the universal quantifier. And to refer to this, I'll be using the term wide scope, right? So, and what that means is just that the existential in the structure needs to be higher than the universal, right? That is wide scope. So scope is in semantics is just the same as C command in syntax. And the other interpretation of the sentence is in 9a here. So where the universal has wide scope over the existential, and the meaning of that sentence is, for every kid X, it is the case that X watched a movie, but all children might have watched a different movie, right? So kid A might have watched Titanic, kid B might have watched whatever, yeah, Teletubbies the movie, this sort of stuff. So, but so you might be asking yourself, okay, the sentence is ambiguous. We've talked about this with Danny yesterday. Where's the covert movement now, right? But what Danny mentioned just before I started was the correspondence between syntax and semantics, right? What we want is a very close mapping from syntactic structure to semantic interpretation. But here, we don't actually get this for one of the readings, right? This one here, the interpretation in 10a, where the existential has wide scope and is higher in the structure, actually violates linear order, right? Because if we look at the sentence, the universal quantifier is actually first and thus higher in the structure. So we would expect the other interpretation to be more salient. So we need an operation to somehow get to the structure where ein Film, yeah, a movie, is higher in the structure, takes wide scope over the universal. And to do this, we need covert movement because we can't see it in the structure despite the interpretation being available. So what we then have is a structure like this, right? And what I've done here in the sister of V0, Cookton, is now a trace, and this indicates that we moved the object further up, right? So now ein Film, so the existential NP or DP, whatever you want to call it, has higher scope. It's higher in the structure than the universal, and that gives us the reading that we're after, right? For one specific movie, it holds that every kid has watched it. And this is right, as I say below, this is the exact configuration that explains why the wide scope reading of the indefinite is possible. And we got there by covert movement, right? This type of movement is called quantifier raising, as I've mentioned before. And it's exactly like normal movement, like overt movement. It just happens after the spell out. So after I pronounce the sentence, this type of movement applies. Or for a hearer would, upon hearing the sentence, apply quantifier raising to get to that interpretation. But because we can't see it, it is termed post-syntactically. It applies at LF. And LF is the structure that we use for semantic interpretation. So what am I writing down here? Ah, right, okay. So again, this is a simplification. There's more in the appendix around this because we actually need multiple applications of quantifier raising here. Is there a summary? No, okay. So this is where we are with quantifier raising. And please, if you have questions, ask me now, because I think this is more important than reconstruction. more important than the next type of covert movement we'll be looking at. Because quantifier raising shows up all the time. It shows up all the time in Danny's research. It shows up all the time in my research. But reconstruction is a bit rarer.
I mean, I do have a question.
Go ahead.
You said that you have to move to have 2 instances of quantifier raising, right?
Right.
And I'm wondering why. I mean, isn't it just enough to move a movie so that it has higher scope?
So for the scope, yes. So this gives us the configuration that is fine for the scope. No. You're right. You're completely right. Here we only need one application of QR. Yeah, I lived here, but
I was right. Sorry.
yeah, we only need one application of QR. You're right, but the reason we do it is not the reason we do QR here is not because we want this interpretation, right? The reason we actually do QR is so that the sentence is interpretable in the first place. But for the surface order, for the surface scope, where the universal outscopes the indefinite, we need another instance of QR. Right there, we would have 2 instances. But yeah, good catch. Any other questions? I know this might be tough. Like, I don't know how much you understand, but please, if I can answer questions, shoot. Okay, then I'll quickly move through reconstruction. So reconstruction is the other type of covert movement, right? And it's to do this, we need a bit more of an elaborate setup. Again, German, because this doesn't work in English in the same constructions. So we have the German sentence, ein Reporter hat berichtet, dass auf der Party ein Regisseur jeden Schauspieler beleidigt hat. So a newsman reported that at a party, a director insulted every actor. Right, and this sentence has only one interpretation, namely there is one specific director such that he insulted every actor. Right, and this is surface scope, right? This one here, ein Regisseur outscopes jeden Schauspieler, right? So the interpretation is completely compatible with the linear order. Now let's look at something else. So this is the same sentence, but we apply scrambling, which is an operation in German where you can just switch the word order. So, and then we have the sentence in 14. Ein Reporter hat berichtet, dass auf der Party jeden Schauspieler ein Regisseur beleidigt hat. So we switched jeden Schauspieler und ein Regisseur, but crucially, we didn't change the roles, right? Ein Regisseur is still the subject and jeden Schauspieler is still the object, right? Well, the only thing we changed is the position in the sentence. And I'll skip asking you guys what it means because I think it's clear, right? This sentence is ambiguous. This has, again, two readings, and I have them here, right? So it has the reading that we had before. Es gibt einen Regisseur, there is one director such that he insulted every actor, and then the other one where there's, that's in 15b, for every actor there exists a director such that this director insults that actor, right? So we have multiple directors in this reading, at least potentially. And here we wanted, so this is also perfectly in line with the linear order, right? So the universal outscopes the indefinite. So the universal outscopes the existential quantifier. What we want to know is why this reading, right, the existential over the universal, is available. And to do this, we need reconstruction. And reconstruction really just means if we have the copy theory of movement, we don't interpret the higher copy, but we interpret the lower copy. Right, that's reconstruction. That's really all there is to it. So instead of interpreting the higher copy, which we usually always do, right? In most kinds of movement, we interpret the higher copy and disregard the lower copy. But with reconstruction, we do the exact opposite. So we interpret the lower one while disregarding the higher one. So, and this is the intermittent summary for reconstruction, right? It's like, it's a bit convoluted, but I hope you understand what I'm saying. So in German, scrambling with multiple scopally sensitive elements leads to ambiguities, right? We saw this. The unscrambled sentence has only one interpretation, the scrambled one has two. However, if we scramble, we have more interpretations available, and only one is actually compatible with the linear order. And to get to the other interpretation, we use reconstruction, right? Which is also after spell out, so it's covert movement, but before LF interpretation, right? So we do it before we interpret the structure, but after we pronounce the structure. And again, the higher copy is ignored, but we instead use the lower copy. If you're a proponent of the trace theory of movement, then we actually need to lower, right? Then we actually move it back down. Then the higher copy gets moved back. But with the copy theory of movement, right, this element is in both positions at once. So we can just choose which one we want to interpret, but with the trace theory, we go back down. So what you can also see here, I think, is that QR and reconstruction are sort of the inverse of each other, right? QR moves up and reconstruction moves down, or forces at least the lower copy to be interpreted. So one is up, one is down, but they do the same thing essentially, at least in the cases we looked at here. So, and I'm not sure if there's more. There's a conclusion, right? So just to briefly sum up, so we know that there's overt movement, right? We know this since we knew this since the dawn of time, basically. But there is also covert movement that happens after syntax and after spell out. So this doesn't change the linear order of the sentence as we hear, read, or see it, but it changes the interpretation. And we have two kinds. One is QR, quantifier raising, that causes something to be interpreted in a higher position, so to take higher scope, wider scope. And reconstruction, the inverse, causes the lower copy to be interpreted. Right? And this is also, and because reconstruction really is the inverse of quantifier raising, some people call reconstruction quantifier lowering. Like, this is contentious, not all people agree with this, but if you can, like, if it sticks in your mind easier, you can just think of it as quantifier lowering. And that, I think, is everything I had to say. Yeah, so Danny will upload the slides, and then you can look at the stuff in the appendix. It's like an additional 10 slides or so, just for the people who are interested. Okay, before we conclude, maybe, are there any questions I can answer? I know this was really fast, but I hope it was still kind of understandable.
Yeah, I mean, it was really nice. Thanks a lot, Mike.
Of course.
I mean, let me just add that, so this is just for you to understand, then when we consider which quantifier we want to interpret first at the semantic level, right? If you want to have a full-fledged linguistic theory with a syntax semantics interface working in the right way, when you do stuff at the semantic level, you need to have a counterpart of what is going on at the syntactic level, right? And you can do this in different ways. There are many theories on the market, and we are not going to talk about these syntactic operations that much in our class because it's not about syntax, but this is just to let you know that if you want to have a formal system, anything that you do on the one side has to have a correspondent on the other side. Otherwise, as Mike said, you're gonna get into crashes of your derivations, basically, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, a quick question is, can we just do everything without quantifier lowering? Can we just say that when we switch the order of two quantifiers, we are just raising one, and if we don't, we just leave them there and we don't do anything?
I mean, so in these cases you can, yes, but there are other cases where reconstruction doesn't really operate on quantifiers, where you can't just do multiple instances of quantifier raising, and people have observed that this seems to be the same type of operation, so reconstruction. But yes, in principle for these cases, yeah.
Okay. And so if you know, if this thing is reasonable, then is it safely to assume that every time that we are going to talk about, for instance, surface scope of inverse scope during the class, some of these operations might actually must take place in order for our interpretation to happen the way it happens?
I think so, yeah. So I mean, it depends, right? There are some. I mean, as long as you can't see it on the linear order, then I would think so. But maybe somebody was making noises. No, but yes, I think so. In principle, yes. Something like this must apply in order for us to get the inverse scope reading.
Okay. So yes, thanks so much for this very interesting presentation. Is there any other question? So, I mean, today we introduced a lot of very difficult notions, right? Don't be scared about these things. Every time that we will encounter a new phenomenon, or that we will discuss a new phenomenon, we will go back to the basics, basically, and see exactly what our intuitions and what the alleged operation going in the background are, okay? But we are not going to talk about quantifier raising and quantifier lowering a lot. We will just assume that at some level, your syntax is going to do this stuff in order to match what happens at the semantics level. We are going to be more interested in what happens in the semantics. But I really wanted Mike to have this presentation because I think that it gives you some idea about the fact that if you want to have a formal system that works in order to account for the intuitions that we have, then you have to do your homework right. You have to have the right operation in syntax. And this is a big problem for theoretical linguists, because people are fighting about which are the right ways to derive the structure. Now, if you are a super skeptical guy with respect to linguistic structures, and you think that these things are not really necessary, they're like unnecessary complications with respect to how we interpret language, that's completely fine, right? You can criticize all this stuff. You can say, I don't buy one single bit of what Mike said or what I said, but then you better have a good story, because you can tell me that I'm wrong, or that Mike is wrong, or that, you know, Chomsky is wrong, or that Montague is wrong, but then you have to give me a model that works at least as well as the model that I'm assuming works, right? Otherwise, what we are going to do is just to throw away something that gives you some results, and we are left with nothing, basically. We are just saying, yeah, you know, things must happen some way in order to give this result. Yes, but what is this way, right? So again, fundamental issues about linguistics, but what's relevant to us is that these issues are gonna show up continuously during our class. That is mainly focused on how we do interpret this stuff in real time, and how children, for instance, acquire these kind of operations and how and when they can actually perform these operations, okay? So whether you want to buy one framework or the other doesn't really matter. The important thing is that you know, we assume a certain framework that at least can give us the right derivations, can give us the right effects. That's the prerequisite to have a working model for anything, even at the processing level. Okay, to say we get this meaning and we don't really know how it happens, it must happen some way, is not enough, at least for us. Okay, good. So if there is no other question, I guess this is it for this week. Okay, so the next week we will start diving directly into the topic of scope ambiguity. Okay, so again, we'll have to introduce a little bit some examples like the ones Mike mentioned, like when you have, for instance, an indefinite like A and a universal quantifier or things like this. And we will explore some additional phenomenon. Now, I don't want to bore you with too much theory before starting to dive into data. So I will start speaking about some experimental data already at the next class, okay? To try to show you that what we are talking about at theoretical level has some important consequences for the way we interpret and we process language in real time, okay? And yeah, and then we will talk a little bit more about these entailment patterns and their relationship with scope ambiguity. And this will finally give us the theoretical knowledge in order to understand and to think about a lot of interesting experimental results that came from experiment investigating how adults and children interpret this kind of sentences. Okay? So yes, if there is not any other question, I guess I will see you next week, and we are meeting on Monday at 11. Okay. So yes, thanks, Mike. Thank you, guys, and see you on Monday. Bye-bye.
Next time.
Bye.
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 I just wanted to say that on Monday I will arrive a bit later because I have another lesson until 11:30.
Okay, it's no problem. I mean, you don't have to you know, excuse yourself.
Okay.
But you know, bear in mind that I'm gonna put all the classes and the recording of the classes online, so you can also see what you have missed. You know, after that.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.